By the 22nd of November, the Pearl Harbor task force of 31 ships, under command of Vice Admiral Nagumo, had assembled in utmost secrecy at Tonkin Bay, in the Kuril Islands. The assemblage consisted of a striking force of 6 fleet carriers, Carrier Divisions 1, 2, and 5, a screening force of 2 fast battleships, Battleship Division 3, 2 heavy cruisers, Cruiser Division 8, and 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers, Destroyer Squadron 1, an advanced patrol unit of 3 submarines, and a fleet train of 8 tankers. At 6 on the 26th of November, this force sortied and headed via a devious route for a prearranged standby point at latitude 42°N, longitude 170°W. At this point it was to receive final orders depending upon the ultimate decision taken on the question of whether or not to go to war. On the 1st of December this decision was made, and it was for war. A combined fleet order dispatched the following day to Nagumo's eastward moving task force definitely set the 8th of December as the date for attacking Pearl Harbor. On the 3rd of December the task force altered course southeastward, and at 11:30 on the 6th it turned due south to close the island of Oahu, increasing speed to 24 knots. In the very early morning of the 7th, with only a few hours to go before the target would be within plane striking distance, the task force received disturbing information from Tokyo. An Imperial General Headquarters intelligence report, received at 0050, indicated that no carriers were at Pearl Harbor. These were to have been the top priority targets of our attack, and we had counted on their being in port. All of the American carriers, as well as all heavy cruisers, had apparently put to sea. But the report indicated that a full count of battleships remained in the harbor. Despite this late-hour upset, Vice Admiral Nagumo and his staff decided that there was now no other course left but to carry out the attack as planned. The U.S. battleships, though secondary to the carriers, were still considered an important target, and there was also a faint possibility that some of the American carriers might have returned to Pearl Harbor by the time our planes struck. So the task force sped on toward its goal, every ship now tense and ready for battle. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 7th of December, Nagumo's carriers reached a point 200 miles north of Pearl Harbor. The 0 hour had arrived. The carriers swung into the wind, and at 6 the first wave of the 353 plane attack force, of which I was in overall command, took off from the flight decks and headed for the target. The first wave was composed of 183 planes, level bombers, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. I flew in the lead plane, followed closely by 49 Type 97 level bombers under my direct command, each carrying one 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb. To starboard and slightly below flew Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata of Akagi and his 40 planes from the 4 carriers, each carrying one torpedo slung to its fuselage. Above me and to port was a formation of 51 Type 99 carrier dive bombers led by Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi from Shokaku. Each of these planes carried one ordinary 250-kilogram bomb. A 3-group fighter escort of 43 Zeros, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya from Akagi, ranged overhead, on the prowl for possible enemy opposition. The weather was far from ideal. A 20-knot northeast wind was raising heavy seas. Flying at 3,000 meters, we were above a dense cloud layer which extended down to within 1,500 meters of the water. The brilliant morning sun had just burst into sight, setting the eastern horizon aglow. 1 hour and 40 minutes after leaving the carriers I knew that we should be nearing our goal. Small openings in the thick cloud cover afforded occasional glimpses of the ocean, as I strained my eyes for the first sight of land. Suddenly a long white line of breaking surf appeared directly beneath my plane. It was the northern shore of Oahu. Veering right toward the west coast of the island, we could see that the sky over Pearl Harbor was clear. Presently the harbor itself became visible across the central Oahu plain, a film of morning mist hovering over it. I peered intently through my binoculars at the ships riding peacefully at anchor. One by one I counted them. Yes, the battleships were there all right, 8 of them. But our last lingering hope of finding any carriers present was now gone. Not one was to be seen. It was 0749 when I ordered my radio man to send the command, attack. He immediately began tapping out the prearranged code signal to TO2. Leading the whole group, Lieutenant Commander Murata's torpedo bombers headed downward to launch their torpedoes, while Lieutenant Commander Ite's fighters raced forward to sweep enemy fighters from the air. Takahashi's dive bomber group had climbed for altitude and was out of sight. My bombers, meanwhile, made a circuit toward Barber's Point to keep pace with the attack schedule. No enemy fighters were in the air, nor were there any gun flashes from the ground. The effectiveness of our attack was now certain, and a message, "Surprise attack successful," was accordingly sent to Akagi at 0753. The message was received by the carrier and duly relayed to the homeland, but, as I was astounded to learn later, the message from my plane was also heard directly by Nagato in Hiroshima Bay and by the General Staff in Tokyo. The attack was opened with the first bomb falling on Wheeler Field, followed shortly by dive bombing attacks upon Hickam Field and the bases at Fort Island. Fearful that smoke from these attacks might obscure his targets, Lieutenant Commander Murata cut short his group's approach toward the battleships anchored east of Fort Island and released torpedoes. A series of white waterspouts soon rose in the harbor. Lieutenant Commander Ite's fighters, meanwhile, had full command of the air over Pearl Harbor. About 4 enemy fighters which took off were promptly shot down. By 0800 there were no enemy planes in the air, and our fighters began strafing the airfields. My level bombing group had entered on its bombing run toward the battleships moored to the east of Fort Island. On reaching an altitude of 3,000 meters, I had the sighting bomber take position in front of my plane. As we closed in, enemy anti-aircraft fire began to concentrate on us. Dark gray puffs burst all around. Most of them came from ships' batteries, but land batteries were also active. Suddenly my plane bounced as if struck by a club. When I looked back to see what had happened, the radioman said, "The fuselage is holed and the rudder wire damaged." We were fortunate that the plane was still under control, for it was imperative to fly a steady course as we approached the target. Now it was nearly time for ready to release, and I concentrated my attention on the lead plane to note the instant his bomb was dropped. Suddenly a cloud came between the bomb site and the target, and just as I was thinking that we had already overshot, the lead plane banked slightly and turned right toward Honolulu. We had missed the release point because of the cloud and would have to try again. While my group circled for another attempt, others made their runs, some trying as many as 3 before succeeding. We were about to begin our second bombing run when there was a colossal explosion in Battleship Row. A huge column of dark red smoke rose to 1,000 meters. It must have been the explosion of a ship's powder magazine. The shock wave was felt even in my plane, several miles away from the harbor. We began our run and met with fierce anti-aircraft concentrations. This time the lead bomber was successful, and the other planes of the group followed suit promptly upon seeing the leader's bombs fall. I immediately lay flat on the cockpit floor and slid open a peephole cover in order to observe the fall of the bombs. I watched 4 bombs plummet toward the earth. The target 2 battleships moored side by side lay ahead. The bombs became smaller and smaller and finally disappeared. I held my breath until 2 tiny puffs of smoke flashed suddenly on the ship to the left, and I shouted, "2 hits." When an armor-piercing bomb with a time fuse hits the target, the result is almost unnoticeable from a great altitude. On the other hand, those which miss are quite obvious because they leave concentric waves to ripple out from the point of contact, and I saw 2 of these below. I presumed that it was Battleship Maryland we had hit. As the bombers completed their runs they headed north to return to the carriers. Pearl Harbor and the airbases had been pretty well wrecked by the fierce strafings and bombings. The imposing naval array of an hour before was gone. Anti-aircraft fire had become greatly intensified, but in my continued observations I saw no enemy fighter planes. Our command of the air was unchallenged. Suddenly, at 0854, I overheard Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, flight commander of Zuikaku and commander of the second wave, ordering his 170 planes to the attack. The second wave had taken off from the carriers at 0715, 1 hour and 15 minutes after the first, and was now over the target. My plane did not withdraw with the first attack wave, but continued to fly over the island so that I could observe results achieved by both assaults. Furthermore, it was planned that my plane would remain until the last to serve as guide back to the carriers for any straggling fighters, since these carried no homing devices. The 54 level bombers of the second wave, under Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki, were Type 97s, armed with 2 250 kg or 1 250 kg and 6 60 kg bombs. Their targets were the air bases. The dive bomber group, led by Lieutenant Commander Takashi Jagusa, Soria's flight commander, consisted of 80 Type 90 bombers, armed with 250 kg bombs, and its original assignment had been to attack the enemy carriers. Since there were no carriers present, these planes were to select targets from among the ships which remained unscathed or only slightly damaged by the first wave attack. Fighter cover for the second wave was provided by 36 Zeros commanded by Lieutenant Saburo Shindo of Akagi. On the heels of the attack order, Lieutenant Shindo's fighter group swooped down to strafe Pearl Harbor and the airfields. Aguza's dive bombers then came in over the East Coast mountains and dove to the attack, following the lead of the commander's plane, which was easily distinguishable because of its red-painted tail. Billowing smoke from burning ships and harbor installations greatly hampered the attack, but the dive bombers flew in doggedly to accomplish their mission. Most of Shimazaki's level bombers, which followed the dive bombers in, concentrated on Hickam Field. The rest attacked Ford Island and Kaneohe Air Base. They flew at no more than 2,000 meters in order to bomb from beneath the clouds. In spite of this, no planes were lost to anti-aircraft fire, although nearly half of them were holed. By 13, all surviving aircraft of both attack waves had returned to the carriers. Of the total of 353 planes, only 9 fighters, 15 dive bombers, and 5 torpedo planes, along with their crews aggregating 55 officers and men, were missing. Against these almost negligible losses, 8 battleships, virtually the entire battleship strength of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, were believed to have been sunk or severely damaged. Besides, enemy air strength based on Oahu appeared to have been decisively smashed, with the result that not a single plane attacked the Japanese force. Undeniably, this added up to a remarkable success, one which even the old believers in battleship primacy would hail as a complete triumph. Even so, the flyers returning from the initial attack were all in favor of continuing the offensive to inflict still further damage on the enemy. Our striking power remained virtually intact. Control of the air was completely ours. Nothing seemed to stand in the way. A further airstrike, I thought, might help draw them in, and then if the task force, instead of retiring by the same route that it had come, skirted around to the south of the islands and headed toward the Marshalls, carrying out air searches as it went, there might be a reasonable chance of locating the American carriers. This spur-of-the-moment idea received an enthusiastic reception from my fellow officers, but it had to be dismissed because of one insuperable obstacle. Our tanker train was already heading for a prearranged stand-by point on the northern withdrawal route, and if it were now redirected southward, it could not possibly catch up with the task force in time to provide the much-needed fuel. So the last hope of hitting the enemy carriers was reluctantly abandoned. As the next best thing, when I reported to Admiral Nagumo the results of the initial strike, I strongly recommended a further attack on Oahu. His decision, however, which I believe was influenced to a considerable degree by his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, was to terminate the attack and withdraw. At 13:30, upon a flag signal from Akagi, the task force set a north-northwest course and retired as swiftly and silently as it had come. With the exception of a specially organized force composed of Carrier Division 2 Soryu, Hiryu, Cruiser Division 8 Tone, Chikuma, and 2 destroyers, which was detached on the 16th of December by Combined Fleet Order to support the invasion of Wake Island, the task force headed back for the Inland Sea and Hashirajima anchorage, where it arrived on the 23rd of December. The first attack had inflicted practically all the damage that we had anticipated, and a further attack could not have been expected to augment this damage to any great extent. Even in the first attack, the enemy's anti-aircraft fire reaction had been so prompt as virtually to nullify the advantage of surprise. In a further attack, it had to be expected that our losses would increase out of all proportion to the results achievable. Radio intercepts indicated that the enemy still had at least 50 large-type aircraft in operational condition, and at the same time the whereabouts and activities of his carriers, heavy cruisers, and submarines were unknown. To remain within attack range of enemy land-based planes was distinctly to our disadvantage, especially in view of the limited range 250 miles of our own air searches and the undependability of our submarine patrol then operating in the Hawaiian area. Furthermore, as explained earlier, the primary objective of our initial war strategy was to secure oil resources. The Pearl Harbor attack itself was conceived purely as a supporting operation toward that objective. As our military resources were limited and oil was our immediate goal, there was no reason at this stage to contemplate the seizure of Hawaiian territory. All in all, the Pearl Harbor operation did achieve its basic strategic objective of preventing the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with Japanese operations in the South. But the failure to inflict any damage on the enemy carriers still weighed heavily on the minds of Admiral Nagumo's air staff and flying officers as the task force cruised back toward home waters. We immediately began laying plans for subsequent operations to achieve what we had been unable to accomplish at Pearl Harbor. On the one hand, we labored to perfect a new tactical doctrine for a sea engagement against the enemy carrier force. The essence of this doctrine was the amalgamation of the air units on board all 6 of our carriers into a single powerful attack group of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes, which would strike the enemy all at once in overwhelming strength. We were fully confident that these new tactics would assure us of victory. On the other hand, Commander-The, as operations officer on Nagumo's staff, gave exhaustive thought to the broader strategic and tactical problems. His conclusion also was that our next operation must be an all-out effort to destroy the enemy carriers. And as a means of luring the enemy out from his base so that we might engage him in battle, he thought that invasion operations should be undertaken against Midway Island and also against Kingman's Reef, 960 miles south-southwest of Pearl Harbor. Thus it was Genda who first thought up the basic idea that 6 months later culminated in the Midway operation. Genda's scheme, of course, met with our wholehearted approval. To us it was the logical way to exploit and complete our initial successes, and we felt that the time to strike was now. So anxious were we to get started that suggestions were even made that the whole task force put into troop to support the Wake invasion and then stand by for operations against the enemy carriers. Upon our return to the homeland, however, we found Japanese naval leaders complacently elated over the destruction of so many battleships at Pearl Harbor and not at all receptive toward plans for prompt follow-up action against the enemy carriers. To my knowledge, the only important naval officer who criticized the failure to inflict any damage on the enemy carriers was Rear Admiral Keizo Ueno, then commander of the Yokosuka Naval Air Corps. By the time the main body of the victorious Pearl Harbor attack force got back to home waters, the key Japanese operations in the southern area were well underway. Army forces were already pushing down the Malay Peninsula towards Singapore. Thailand had been occupied. Conquest of the vital Borneo oil fields had begun with the capture of Miri on the 16th of December. At sea, shore-based naval aircraft had scored a signal success only 2 days after the start of hostilities by sinking battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, mainstays of the British Far Eastern Fleet, in the waters east of Malaya. Elsewhere, too, the war was going well for Japan. Conquest of the Philippines, essential to protect the southward line of advance, was proceeding satisfactorily, with enemy air opposition smashed and the first of the 2 main landings on Luzon already accomplished at Lingayen Gulf. The oceanic perimeter to the east had been strengthened by the seizure of Guam in the Marianas, of Makin and Tarawa in the Gilberts, and of Wake, which finally fell under reinforced Japanese assault on the 23rd of December, the same day that the Nagumo force dropped anchor at Hashirajima. Returning amid nationwide rejoicing over Japan's successes everywhere, Admiral Nagumo found that plans had already been made for the next employment of his force. Both the Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet were fully satisfied with the results achieved at Pearl Harbor and saw no need for further neutralizing action against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They had therefore decided to transfer the Nagumo force forthwith to the Southern Theater of Operations, where its first mission was to support the impending invasions of Rabaul and Cavite, in the Bismarck Archipelago. Accordingly the Nagumo force, less the units which had been detached to support the Wake invasion, sortied from the inland sea on 5 January 1942 and, after calling briefly at Truk, continued south to launch pre-invasion airstrikes. On 20 January attack groups took off from the 4 carriers northeast of New Ireland and struck Rabaul. The following day Cavite was hit, simultaneously with neutralization strikes by aircraft from Zuikaku and Shokaku on airfields at Lae and Salamaua, on the eastern New Guinea coast. Nowhere, however, was any appreciable enemy air strength discovered. Leading a powerful force of 90 bombers and fighters in the Rabaul attack, I saw just 2 enemy planes. They were attempting to take off from one of the two airfields and were promptly disposed of by our fighters. The second airfield was empty. Dive bombers dispatched a lone cargo ship caught in the harbor, and my level bomber group, for lack of any more worthwhile target, finally let loose its full load of 800-kilogram bombs on a coastal gun emplacement commanding the harbor entrance. A further strike on Rabaul was carried out on the 22nd, but it was superfluous. The next day our landing forces occupied Rabaul and Cavite without a struggle. All in all, the employment of the Nagumo force in this operation struck me as wasteful and extravagant. If ever a sledgehammer had been used to crack an egg, this was the time. The Nagumo force put back to Truk and prepared to set out for the Celebes, where it was to support southwest area operations. A sudden development intervened, however. Early in the morning of the 1st of February, the very day we were scheduled to sortie, a report came in that enemy carrier-borne aircraft were attacking the Marshalls. Our departure for the Celebes was immediately called off, and instead we headed eastward at top speed to catch the enemy task force. This impulsive action really made little sense. It would take us 2 full days to cover the 1,200-mile distance from Truk to the Marshalls, and in that interval the enemy was sure to retire to safety. Nevertheless, I inwardly rejoiced. Futile as it seemed, I thought our mad dash might be just the gesture that was needed to persuade Combined Fleet to redirect the Nagumo force eastward against its logical and potentially most dangerous opponent, the U.S. carrier force. Throughout the 1st of February reports kept coming in from the Marshalls detailing the enemy raid, but by that night it was evident that the enemy carriers had already vanished from the area. Still the Nagumo force kept speeding eastward during the 2nd of February. And it was only after picking up an American news broadcast announcing the execution of successful raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands that it finally turned back, knowing for certain that the enemy was beyond its grasp. Combined Fleet's reaction, also, proved highly disappointing. It viewed the Marshall's attack merely as an enemy attempt to divert strength from our southern operations. It was quick to criticize the local Island Defense Command for having been taken by surprise, but it failed on its own part to produce any positive and effective plan for dealing with the enemy carrier force. Instead, it took a feeble and purely negative countermeasure which struck me as worse than no action at all. This countermeasure was an order directing the detachment of Carrier Division 5 Zuikaku, Shokaku from the Nagumo force to carry out defensive air patrols east of the homeland. It sprang from Combined Fleet apprehension that the enemy, having directed a successful carrier strike against the Marshalls, might be emboldened to attempt similar strikes against objectives closer to Japan, conceivably even the imperial capital itself. The detachment of the 2 fleet carriers for patrol duty was designed only to guard against this worst eventuality. Unfortunately, its effect was to dissipate the strength of the one Japanese force which, with all 6 of its carriers operating together, could have confidently taken the offensive against any enemy in the Pacific, including the undamaged American carrier force. For the main part of the Nagumo force, however, Combined Fleet had other ideas. The Hashirajima headquarters continued to focus its attention exclusively on the southern area, where it was now most concerned over probable Allied use of Northwest Australia as a base from which to impede Japanese seizure of the Dutch East Indies. Proposals for mounting an amphibious invasion of Port Darwin met a flat rebuff by the Naval General Staff and the Army, so Combined Fleet decided upon the next best alternative, a carrier airstrike to completely wreck base installations in the area. An order was issued assigning this mission to the Nagumo force, less Carrier Division 5. Admiral Nagumo received word of his new assignment as he headed back from the futile sortie toward the Marshalls. Since Rear Admiral Yamaguchi's splinter force, which had been operating separately since the 16th of December, was to rejoin the main body for the Darwin strike, Admiral Nagumo set his course for Palau and ordered Yamaguchi to rendezvous with him there. En route to Palau, Carrier Division 5 broke away from the main body and headed for the homeland. After completing battle preparations, the Nagumo force, now consisting of carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, battleships Hiei and Kirishima, heavy cruisers Tone and Shikuma, light cruiser Abukuma, and 9 destroyers sortied from Palau on the 15th of February and headed for the Banda Sea. Early in the morning of the 19th, it reached a position about 220 miles north-northwest of Port Darwin and launched a strike of 188 planes under my command. As at Rabaul, The job to be done seemed hardly worthy of the Nagumo force. The harbor, it is true, was crowded with all kinds of ships, but a single pier and a few waterfront buildings appeared to be the only port installations. The airfield on the outskirts of the town, though fairly large, had no more than 2 or 3 small hangars, and in all there were only 20-odd planes of various types scattered about the field. No planes were in the air. A few attempted to take off as we came over but were quickly shot down, and the rest were destroyed where they stood. While the fighter group went after the enemy planes, I detailed the dive bombers to attack ships in the harbor and led the main strength of my level bombers in an attack on the harbor installations and a nearby cluster of oil tanks. The rest of the level bombers went to destroy the airfield hangars. Anti-aircraft fire was intense but largely ineffectual, and we quickly accomplished our objectives. The final tally was 11 ships, including some destroyers sunk, over 20 enemy planes destroyed, and all base installations effectively smashed. The Nagumo force withdrew to Staring Bay, on the southeast coast of the Celebes, but did not stay there long. The invasion of Java, culmination of the southern operations, was to begin on the 1st of March. To support it, the Nagumo force, together with Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's southern force main body of 4 battleships, was to skirt around to the south of Java and cut off any possible enemy reinforcement or escape. The combined force sortied from Staring Bay on the 25th of February and headed into the Indian Ocean through Ombai Strait. On the 3rd of March, a 180-plane strike was launched from our carriers against the South Javanese port of Cilacap, netting a bag of about 20 ships sunk. In addition, up to the 5th of March, 3 enemy destroyers and 14 transports were sunk trying to escape southward, and 3 other transports were captured. The landing operations meanwhile went off on schedule, and on the 9th of March Java surrendered. The Nagumo force returned to Staring Bay to await orders. By the latter part of March Sumatra was also in Japanese hands, as were the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. In Burma, Japanese forces had taken Rangoon and were pushing on to the north. To secure these newly won areas and make it possible to supply the Burma forces directly by sea, Combined Fleet decided that it was necessary to strike a blow at British surface and air strength in the Indian Ocean. Enemy forces there were estimated at 2 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 4 to 7 light cruisers, and a number of destroyers, plus a shore-based air strength of about 300 planes. Admiral Kondo, as Commander-in-Chief of Japanese naval forces in Southeast Asia, assigned the mission to the Nagumo Force. Carrier Division 5, detached in February, was now restored to Admiral Nagumo's command for the operation, and the task force was further reinforced by 2 of Admiral Kondo's battleships. Sortying from Staring Bay on the 26th of March, the force headed into the Indian Ocean and opened its offensive with a surprise airstrike at Colombo, Ceylon, on the 5th of April. All the carriers that had hit Pearl Harbor were participating except Kaga, which had gone to the homeland for repairs. The first attack wave took off from the carriers at 30 minutes before dawn, about 200 miles south of Ceylon. This force, under my command, consisted of 36 fighters, 54 dive bombers, and 90 level bombers. We were expecting trouble this time, since an enemy flying boat had spotted us the preceding day and, though shot down by our combat air patrol, had undoubtedly reported the presence of our force. As we closed the target, flying through dense but occasionally broken clouds, I suddenly spotted a formation of 12 enemy swordfish-type torpedo planes. They were flying at a much lower altitude, without any fighter escort, and obviously had not noticed us. I quickly signaled Lieutenant Commander Ataya, the fighter group commander, who was flying to port, to close me. When he had done so, I pointed down toward the enemy formation and motioned for him to attack. After a few moments, Ataya nodded and veered off to lead his fighters against the still unsuspecting enemy. The lumbering swordfish, caught from above, were shot down to the last plane in one swift attack. Since the luckless enemy planes must have been on their way to attack our carriers, I was sure now that enemy fighters were out to intercept us. To avoid them, I led the whole attack force around to the north of Colombo, and then we dashed in toward the objective. Still wet from a recent rain squall, the city lay glistening in the sun. No airborne fighters were visible as we came over, and the big airfield southeast of the city was also empty of planes, so it was apparent that the enemy interceptors had gone south to meet us. While Commander Itaya's fighters and a few of my level bombers headed to attack the airfield, The other level bombers and the dive bomber group struck at shipping in the harbor. No warships were present, but considerable damage was inflicted on cargo vessels, with which the harbor was jammed. As the last bombers made their attack runs, I prepared to radio back to flagship Akagi that our mission was accomplished and that a second wave attack would be unnecessary. Just then a terse message was overheard from one of the Nagumo Force float planes, which had taken off simultaneously with the air attack force to search over a broad sector of the western Indian Ocean. 2 enemy heavy cruisers sighted heading south.